So we have a lot going on today in the readings. And on top of that, today's gospel reading is a continuation in Luke from last week, and then a missing piece, and then what we heard today. Do you remember what happened last week? Do you remember talking about two brothers who were squabbling over inheritance? And do you remember Jesus' parable about the rich fool? Now, this rich man, if you remember the parable, had great lands with abundant crops, so much so that he pulled down his barn and he built a bigger barn. And he put all of his crops away, and they were stored away. And then he said, I will eat and drink and be merry. But then Jesus turned to him and said, you're a fool. Because that very night, his life was taken. And all that he had stored up was for naught. And it ended by telling us that we are not to store our treasures away and hide them away, but that our richness is in God. And then Luke continues the argument, just in case we didn't quite hear it the first time. And he adds this piece that we don't hear in the lections, but I'm going to read it for you because I think it's pertinent. He said to his disciples, therefore I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat, or about your body, what you will wear. For life is more than food, and the body more than clothing. Consider the ravens. They neither sow nor reap. They have neither storehouse nor barn, and yet God feeds them. Of how much more value are you than the birds? And can you, by worrying, add a single hour to your lifespan? If then you are not able to do such a small thing, why do you worry about the rest? Consider the lilies, how they grow. They neither toil nor spin. Yet I tell you, even Solomon in all his glory was not clothed like one of these. If God so clothes the grass of the field, which is alive today and tomorrow and thrown into the oven, how much more will he clothe you, you of little faith? And do not keep striving for what you eat and what you drink. Do not keep worrying. For it is the nations of the world that strive after all these things, and your Father knows that you need them. Instead, strive for the kingdom, and these things will be given to you as well. And then he goes in to begin our passage today. Do not be afraid, little flock, for it is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. Do we believe this? Luke is making an argument. He is contrasting the ways of the world with the ways of God. We are to seek God's kingdom. This is not a place, but it is a way of living in the world. It is where God is first and foremost. It is where God's vision of abundance for all of creation is held first and foremost. It is a way of living that answers the call to give food to the hungry and drink to the thirsty. It is the way of living that we promise when we are baptized in our baptismal covenant. This is what Luke is holding up, as opposed to the way of the world, the way of the rich fool, the one who fears what is to come, the one who fears there will not be enough and has to store up all of the treasures and has to miserly hold them just in case. Those fears, they are in all of us. They are the way our world works. When I was back in Boston and I was looking at becoming ordained and starting to talk to people about that process, one of the things that happens is you get volunteered for things. And when you're in that place, you don't really get to say no. You just say, okay, sure, I'll do that. And I was asked to be on stewardship, much to my chagrin. And beyond that, I had a conversation with a retired financier and a retired bishop who were on that committee. And we were talking, and I acknowledged that I hate pledging. Absolutely hate it. Thus, they turned around to me and said, you're the one that's giving the pledge talk about why we should pledge. And I kind of went, ugh. It meant I had to face my own fears. At that point in time, I was a graduate student, and I never quite knew if I would have the money to pay rent or grocery bill. How it worked is I lived off my teaching, and every semester, the number of teaching slots that I got depended on how many students signed up. They had 10 days to sign up and to transfer to other classes and work it all out. So it wasn't till the 10th day of the semester that I would find out what I was teaching, what subjects in what department, and whether I had enough of those teachings to pay my rent on October 1st. So the thought of writing down a number on a pledge sheet and saying, I'll give this to you, that was scary. I didn't know if I could pledge a little amount, because then it would seem cheap. Or maybe I would do a bigger amount, but then I might not be able to fulfill it. And that would feel shameful. And in talking with the people on the stewardship committee, what I realized is that my fears in trying to make my rent and my grocery bill and my coffees were admittedly on the very small end of income in and income out. But that people all around me had similar fears. They just had more zeros after their bills and their incomes than I did. And all of it was about living in the world by the world's ways. It was not about trusting in God and God's ways. It was not about the next line that we hear after we're not to be afraid is to sell all your possessions and give alms. Giving alms is very specific. It's to give it to the poor. That is God's way. The contrast is that possessions are going after them, storing them up, hoarding them, adjusting our lives to make more of them, is of the world. When in fact, the priorities of our life are to be in and about God. We are to do our tasks and our work. It is not that crops are not created, but all of it is done and ordered according to God. The opposite of fear is faith. Say it one more time. The opposite of fear is faith. Faith is how we live in God. It is what St. Paul says in the iconic opening line. Faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. Faith is the belief in God that that promise that God made, like to Abraham and Sarah, who he made parents of the nations, to us is the kingdom of God. That is the promise God makes. And when we say yes to God, when we put our priorities of God and not of our own will, it is then that that promise is fulfilled. It is not fulfilled for one, it is fulfilled for all at the same time. We have a big word, it's called realized eschatology. It means that God's kingdom is here and now in glimpses. And the promise in the end time is that it will be fulfilled in its fullness. And at that moment, all of us, every single one of us, will be living in God's flourishing abundance. All will have enough to eat. All will have enough to drink. All will have shelter over their heads. That is God's vision. And it is ours to treasure. It says that where our treasure is, our heart is. The marketing industry knows that very well. Did you know that if you spend money on something, you value it more? There's studies about it. It's not the other way around. It's not that we value something and we spend money, but the other happens just as well. So when I came to Oregon and I bought a new Honda Fit, the first new car I had bought in a while, I now go and see every Honda Fit. I see all of them and I can go, I have one of those. I have one just like that. That is what we're trained by the world. We're trained to be proud and to gain who we are by what we buy, by what we store up. And God says, no, there's another way. That is not the way that God has called us to be. So we are invited today to think about what we do with our treasure. Is it where our heart is? Will we follow the path of putting it where we want our heart to go, even if we're not quite sure about that yet? Because that's how it works. It's like a virtue. You become the friend by being the friend. You take your treasure and you put it where your hope is in God, where God's hope is. That is what we are invited to think about and to put into practice. So in the words of the gospel, go forth and place your treasure, for there your heart is. Amen.